It is my pleasure to introduce Asma Emadi, who is a graduate student in the Masters of Fine Arts program at MCAD. Asma grew up in Damascus, Syria, in a multicultural family. She studied art for 2 years in Syria before transferring to St. Cloud State University, and she is now an MFA film candidate at MCAD, where she makes art about political trauma and various topics that pertain to her background and experiences. And if you will bear with me, I'd like to read also from her artist statement, which I feel is very powerful. Asma writes, quote, "I live a politicized existence. Being Syrian in today's climate necessitates it, and so I make political art. Political art at its best asks questions rather than providing answers. It whispers rather than screams, and it does not necessarily contain a specific call to action. Rather, it imprints upon the viewer in a manner that remains present within them after they have departed the piece. With my work, I aim to heighten the emotional experience of the viewer and to communicate a completely foreign occurrence in a manner that forms an emotional investment. The viewer leaves my work not feeling that this is the plight of another, but a shared human experience. My practice hinges on my ability to do this, to translate emotions and experiences into a common tongue that can be understood in a space that is beyond the specificity of language and culture, and instead resides within the collective human experience." End quote. In her paper, Asma examines a contemporary work by the sculptor Patrizia Guerresi in relationship to the idea of the feminine divine in Islamic theology. Please join me in welcoming Asma.
Thank you, Jessica. Supha. Supha is a sculpture by the artist Patrizia Guerresi. It hangs from the ceiling of the Contemporary Art Wing in the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Cast from resin, it depicts a purely white figure of a human form in a fetal-like position. It hangs from the elongated hat on its bald head, and a piece of white lycra wraps around the form and then cascades to the floor. The dissimilarity between the suspended resin and the cascading fabric lends an air of weightlessness to the resin, an illusion only broken by the hook connecting it to a vent in the ceiling. In 1991, Guerresi traveled to Senegal, where she converted to Sufism, which is a mystical aesthetic branch of Islam. Her status as a stranger and newcomer lent her insight that one immersed in the culture his or her own whole life would not have. Guerresi writes, quote, "Being foreign gives us the possibility of not agreeing with reality. It is the magic of looking at the things of the world with amazement and curiosity," end quote. Thus began a new awakening within her art. Guerresi's art interpreted Sufism in new and unexpected ways, creating sculptures that existed within both worlds, the world of contemporary art and the world of mystical Sufi Islam. This particular work, Supha, is the artist's attempt to create a new religious iconography that repurposes religious texts in order to excavate and construct a female Islamic divine within the discourse of contemporary art. Guerresi says of her trips to Senegal, quote, "I became interested in Islamic mysticism, to which I converted. My work was enriched with new languages and feelings, giving me new artistic and spiritual strength," end quote. In particular, Guerresi adopted an approach to Sufism and God in a female-centric manner, a tradition not innovated by Guerresi, but that rather follows a line of thinking little mentioned in mainstream Islamic discourses. This tradition is highlighted within poetry frequently written to a beloved in Sufi tradition. This tradition is highlighted within poetry. An example of this poetry is of Ibn Farid in his poem, The Poem of the Sufi Way. Quote, "By her I departed to her, from me never to return. One like me never speaks of coming back," end quote. Here, Ibn Farid speaks of a female beloved as a stand-in for divine love. This symbolism is a common trope in Sufi poetry. This symbolism can be seen further in the poetry of Rumi, one of the more well-known Sufi poets of the 13th century. Quote, "The hal is like the unveiling of the beauteous bride, while the maqam is the king's being alone with the bride, end quote. The hal being a spiritual state and the maqam being a spiritual rank. Ibn al-Arabi, one of the most prominent scholars of Islamic Sufism, who lived and wrote in the 18th century, explains the significance of this symbolism. He attributed the dhat, or the essence of God, to the feminine, and explained that the female aspect is the one in which God can be best understood. It is this tradition that Guerresi pulls from and adds to. She falls within the tradition of the Sufi poets, writing of a feminine divine, and her art is her poetry. Guerresi incorporates her philosophy into every aspect of the sculpture, starting with its name, Supha. She discusses the meaning of the name, remarking that the name Supha is the construction of two words, Sufi and Safa. The author here has constructed her own meaning for these terms, similar to the manner in which she constructs mythology and iconography. She uses a solid historical background, the true meaning of Safa, then combines it with an existing word, Sufi, and comes up with a new name to which she ascribes the meaning she wishes. Safa is the Arabic word for purity and inspiration in its verb form, and in its noun form is the name of one of the two mountains that Hagar is said to have run between while searching for water for her son Ishmael in the Islamic tradition. Safa is also a level of spirituality that symbolizes serenity. The author allows these meanings to exist within the sculpture's name, simultaneously with her new constructed meaning. Supha is the mountain, strong, unmovable, and sacred. She is also the inspiration, the great moment of pure creation within the mind of the artist that leads to great artistic expression. This sculpture is connected with earlier works of Guerresi's practice, specifically that of her previous sculptural works titled Lakrim d'Allah, or Tears of Allah, which feature similar human figures hanging from the ceiling, although they are less formed and bear no distinguishing features. Through the connection of these two works, we can infer that both of them are fashioned to resemble tears. Tomini, a prominent critique of Guerresi's work, says of Lakrim d'Allah, quote, "The drops that descend, the seed which isn't dispersed, the liquid that falling finds its way to its seat in the belly of the cosmos, tears which fall to the earth, swelling the tides of the sea and creating the human being," end quote. Supha represents a transformation of God's tears descending from the universe, a drop of water descending from the divine, forming into milk, growing into the human female. Supha is more formed than these previous sculptural subjects, as she is a more completed form of this creation. Her clothes drape around her and cascade in waves gently to the floor in a puddle of sculpted fabric. In Lakrim d'Allah, it is apparent that the tears are descending. But with Supha, it is not as apparent. Is Supha elevating in the manner of Indian mystics, or is she falling? Is she hovering towards a spiritual state, or falling towards a thirsty land? This state of descending and ascending causes a paradox that can only be solved by the attribution to Supha of the idea of bringing forth life. Thus she is created, and thus she descends. Yet she also is the creator, and thus ascends. Within this harmonizing of multiples is her strength and power. The sculpture's facial features are that of an individual of African heritage. Her eyes have been peacefully closed, and her lips are softly resting. Her African heritage is in contrast to the color in which she is cast, and we as the viewers are not to see her ethnicity in the white resin, but rather her substance. For Supha is made of milk. Milk is a mystical substance in many religious heritages, Islam being one of them. In Islamic mythos, it is narrated that the Prophet Muhammad, when brought to Jerusalem by the angel Gabriel, was offered 3 vessels. One contained water, the second contained wine, and the third contained milk. The legend goes that the prophet chose a vessel of milk and was promptly told by Gabriel that within this choice was the salvation of all nations, as his choice signified humankind's ability to connect with its pure elemental nature. This sculpture recontextualizes this tradition in its attribution of the milk substance and thus the act of salvation to the female. Guerresi has said concerning her use of the symbol of milk in her work, quote, "I consider this white liquid that fed all humanity, from Juno to the goddess Kali, from Sarah and Mary to Fatima, a mystical sign and a universal symbol linking all women," end quote. She uses Sarah as a symbol of Judaism, Mary as a symbol of Christianity, and Fatima as a symbol of the Islamic feminine, connecting all three Abrahamic religions. But Guerresi also mentions the two goddesses, Juno, the Roman goddess, and Kali, the Hindu goddess. The artist is linking the feminine aspect of the Abrahamic religions to more goddess-oriented religions and recontextualizing the Abrahamic religions, which are typically seen as more patriarchal to a more feminine understanding. Her doorway into doing this is the substance of milk. Guerresi says, "God is like a welcoming womb," end quote. This understanding of God is articulated in Supha's fetal position. Her position is representative of her being both the bringer of life, the mother, and the coming of life itself, the fetus. And the connection between these two positions is the uterus. There is a saying within Islamic tradition that can be considered the basis of this understanding, which says, quote, "I am God, and I am Ar-Rahman. I created the uterus and derived it from my name," end quote. The name Ar-Rahman, or the merciful, and Rahim, or uterus, both are derived from the same root word. This name that God takes on, Ar-Rahman, is mentioned in the sentence, Bismillah Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, which is the very first verse of the Quran and one of the most important sentences in Islam. The chapter it is first mentioned in is called, quote, "the mother of the book," end quote. A strong association between Ar-Rahman and the uterus and thus the act of birth can be concluded. Thus, within the notion of God as Ar-Rahman, the human understanding of the acts of bringing forth life and birthing life collide and become one. Supha is the iconography that epitomizes this collision. Supha's power and iconography is reminiscent of the mother goddess sculptures and icons of antiquity. However, unlike the life-bringing mother goddess whose power resides in her sexuality, within her wide hips and engorged breasts, Supha has almost no distinctive sexual features. Her sexuality is so unseen that even Supha's head, which pokes out from beneath her hat, is bald and does not have the cascading hair that one associates with the feminine. Together, these choices paint Supha as an androgynous figure with no apparent sexual characteristics. A duality reminiscent of verses in the Quran in which God is often referred to using the Arabic word nahnu, a preposition used for the plural male or female, or perhaps both. This lends a possible ambiguity and duality to the preposition, a duality and ambiguity reflected within Supha. And this duality is reflected within the Genesis as well. 126 says, quote, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness,'" end quote. Some Jewish scholars who have interpreted this have suggested that this passage narrates an androgynous creation. An Islamic scholar who has confirmed this interpretation is Ibn al-Arabi, who was known to have written of this duality. He specifically analyzes a quote from the Prophet which says, quote, "I was made to love three things of your world, woman, perfume, and the freshness of the eyes that was brought to me in prayer," end quote. From this, Ibn Arabi reasons it may be deduced that the basis is man's yearning for his Lord, who is his origin, and that is why he makes lovable to man the woman whom he extracted for him, from him, and who appeared in his image, end quote. God presents woman in his image to man, who he created in his image. Thus, God's image is both man and woman. Supha as an iconography embraces this dyad and contains both masculine and feminine aspects of the divine. Her traditional Sufi clothing and meditative position emphasize the enthralled state Supha is in. She sits in a position of zikr, or remembrance, a meditation performed by Sufis to reach a state of connection with the light and love of God. The elongated hat and cascading robe Supha wears is that of a Sufi of the Mevlevi order. These clothes are traditionally worn by men during the mystic Sufi whirling dervish dance. It is here that Guerresi challenges the male-centric part of their Sufi rhetoric. As the meditation dances have been historically overwhelmingly male-dominated, Guerresi challenges this tradition and sculpts a calm, meditative position that has been more associated with female Sufis, with the traditional clothing of a more male-dominated tradition. The clothes are symbols within themselves. The white robe is a symbol of the white cloth Muslims wrap their dead in, while the hat is worn as a symbol of the gravestone. In addition to Supha's calm, expressionless face, a strong reference to death is being made, and when seen alongside the fetal position of the sculpture, indicates a rebirth. She wears the clothes once only designated for men and changes their context and use. In Supha's wake lies the corpse of a patriarchal Sufi interpretation, and through her, a feminine rebirth of spirituality and a recontextualization of religious rhetoric is actualized. Guerresi is able to present within this contemporary sculpture a constructed mythology, one that recontextualizes Sufi philosophy and Islamic mythos into a discourse of the feminine divine. She brings to light an unknown aspect of Islamic scholarship, a tradition that glorifies the divine as feminine. Her unique stance between the two cultures allows her to construct Western figural iconography with Sufi Islamic reference. Her iconography contains that which is not only sacred, but human. Supha is a celebration of the femininity of God and the femininity of his creations within Islam. Thank you very much.